Okay, back in the 1970s, when I was just a little kid, we would take some trips up to Canada. This was one of the books I got on one of our trips. Year of the Sasquatch by John Green. And there is the Quaquetal Indian dance mask representing the wild man of the woods. But, and then I also got this John Green book, I think on a later trip, The Sasquatch File. But, of course, has the Patterson Sasquatch on the cover. This is a chapter in the book called Scratches on a Sign. And there's a reason he named it that. It had to do with a sign up in Fife, Washington. But that had evidently been left there by a Sasquatch, or that's what was purported by the witness. But in the same chapter, Mr. Green goes in to an interesting letter that he had gotten. And I'll just go ahead and read Mr. Green's paragraphs here from this entry in the chapter. And it's quite an interesting account. This is one of the more interesting stories, people that I certainly, and probably other people that have read quite a bit of Sasquatch material, have read over the years. And you can imagine the impression this had on a 10 or 11-year-old boy when I first read this. Maybe 9, something like that. But in any case, quoting Mr. Green, third major contributor of reports from Washington has been the Postman. Following are excerpts from 2 letters received during 1969. Both were signed, but I do not think the names are necessary and have not asked permission to use them. The first was written by a lady who grew up on a ranch near Oakville in Grays Harbor County. After giving some of her family history and mentioning that an old Indian chief, Pike Ben, had told her of seeing a Sasquatch on an island between the Chehalis and Black Rivers, she continued as follows. Now he's quoting the lady from her letter. The spring of 1933 was a wet one, and also I remember we had a lot of snow. All the ranches in our area were on the river. We all farmed the bottomland, but built homes on the hillside. This area had been logged by the Balch Logging Company in the period of 1915 to 1923. By 1933, a lot of the hill area had second-growth timber on it. I was attending high school in Oakville at this time, and this particular weekend I had been to a dance in Oakville with a group of other young girls. When I returned home, I always walked around the house to the back door. All my life I had heard coyotes and cougars. Just as I started to open the back door, I heard a very loud noise up on the hill. I had never heard a noise like it before, and I was a little scared. I went in and woke up my mother and told her to come and listen, as this was a noise I had never heard before. Also, I could hear another one answer way over on another hill. Mother got up, and her reaction was so strange that I could hardly believe it was my mother. She kept saying, "It's that terrible ape again." When I kept trying to ask her to explain, she kept saying, "I'll tell you tomorrow, and let's get inside as we are not safe out here." This is the story my mother told me the next day. After my grandfather died, my grandmother divided up the old ranch and gave the children a stump ranch. About 40 acres and most of my mother's land was the area where our house stood. The timber came down almost to the back of the house. She said in the fall of 1912, my father had gone to Aberdeen to sell potatoes he had raised on the 10 acres they had cleared. He had to stay all night, so Mother was alone in the small house. The house had a porch across the front and a large bay window. She said she had not slept very soundly because she was not used to being alone. She said about 1 a.m. she heard a terrible stamping noise on the front porch, a stomping noise on the front porch. She got up to see what it was. It was moonlight outside, and at first she thought it was a bear on the porch. But this animal was standing on its back legs and was so large it was bending over to look in the window. She said it appeared over 6 feet tall and didn't look like a bear at all in the moonlight. She said in a few minutes, it walked over and jumped off the front porch and started around the house. She went into the kitchen so she could get a good look, and she said it looked just like an ape. She said the strange thing that scared her most was the noise it made as it walked around the house. She said as soon as it was daylight, she went over to my grandmother's place and told them what she had seen. Her brothers all made fun of her and told her she had had a nightmare. When my father returned home, he wouldn't believe her either. She said they made her feel so ridiculous, she said she would never mention it again. This was the first time I heard her tell the story. Now, Mr. Green again, the lady also mentions that when she and her husband had a summer home in the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana, they occasionally heard old trappers tell of ape-like creatures in the area. Well, that to me was a very interesting story. And I want you to imagine that, in the late 1960s, a year after Patterson-Gimlin footage, perhaps even before the lady was aware of the Patterson-Gimlin footage, she decides to write to Mr. Green about an incident that had occurred 36 years earlier, in 1933. And she tells the story like that. Gives her name. He didn't repeat her name here, but everyone that knows John Green knows that he wouldn't have published the letter unless it, had a name and it was a believable letter. He may have spoken with the lady, and or the telephone or something, or in a letter, but back and forth. But in any case, I found that a very, very interesting story when I was a boy. And I read that, and that was a story I read to myself a number of times after reading it the first time. And it left quite an impression. And I just, you're asking yourself, why would a woman write a story, write a letter like that was based on anything other than an actual experience that she'd had? And I can't think of any good reason for her to do it. I can think of a lot of reasons for her to tell the truth in a very private context like that, where she's not looking for publicity or anything. She's simply trying to help the work of a man who, as she had heard, was a Sasquatch researcher at that time. But I just, that was one of the stories that as a young person, very young person, still a boy, I read that, and all those things came to mind as I was reading it and in the days after I'd first read it a few times. And those are some of the reasons that at a pretty young age I became convinced there was probably something to Sasquatch.